Hello and welcome to Women's Football Hub. I am your host for this episode. I am Carolyn Kent, and with me today is someone who's a lecturer in psychology at Loughborough University. She has a master's in sport and exercise psychology, and in 2024 obtained her PhD researching mental health and professional women footballers in England. I'm delighted to say that she's here today to talk to me about disordered eating in women's football. Welcome to Women's Football Hub, Dr. Carly Perry.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I'm very excited to hear about this topic because I think actually a lot of people that work in football potentially maybe miss the signs of this sometimes.
Mm.
And it's something that I actually think is quite common when I work with people. And there's been some changes that I really want to kind of go into, especially with GLP-1 and all those things that have come out. But
Yeah.
let's start us off. Let's talk about the difference between disordered eating and clinically diagnosed eating disorder.
Yeah, so very important to start with this because they are different in terms of treatment really around it. But an eating disorder would be more the clinically diagnosed perspective, whereas disordered eating covers a broader spectrum of symptoms and experiences. So disordered eating can range from just restrictive eating all the way to a full-blown eating disorder. Whereas an eating disorder, you would meet the criteria via a meeting with a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist. You'd meet the criteria set out in the DSM-5 around, your food and weight behaviors and your thoughts and feelings towards food. And when we think of an eating disorder, it's normally anorexia, bulimia, binge eating. And whereas disordered eating, like I said, is way broader. And the prevalence for disordered eating is way higher, with it being around 6 to 45%, depending on the study, with women athletes, whereas an eating disorder is far less prevalent. It's about 0.1 to 2%, depending on the culture and the gender and age and all those factors.
And let's talk about why it's important that coaches, players, support staff actually understand that difference, that they are different.
Yeah, I think we see, not that all eating disorders are visible, but I think it's like we know that an eating disorder is a problem or is a red flag or is something we need to look at. Whereas I think disordered eating, as you mentioned at the beginning, sometimes gets missed or overlooked, or those symptoms or behaviors are part of sport. And so what is important is they both can impact mental health and well-being and also physical ability on the pitch. So we need to know if a player is experiencing an eating disorder because the treatment might look a little bit more intensive. Hopefully they don't have to be removed from sport, but depending on what's happening and obviously their story and their physicality, they might need to be removed from sport or in more serious therapy. Whereas somebody who's experiencing disordered eating, they probably can keep playing potentially and maybe work with a nutritionist as well as a psychologist. So just how you go about that and looking after that athlete is completely different with an eating disorder or disordered eating.
And I think there's a couple of things that I've seen over my time and not just women's football, because it can obviously happen in male sport as well. Restrictive eating at times of injury is probably one that I've seen quite commonly. Compensatory behaviours, depending on how they've done, how much have I played, that type of thing. And then, of course, obsessive tracking. That's been an interesting one that I've come up with. Everything's going into the app. And,
Yeah.
are those the typical common ones? Are there others?
Yeah, I think absolutely. So with disordered eating, it's restriction, it's calorie restriction, it's food, like getting rid of categories of food. So I'm not going to eat carbs or I'm going to go vegetarian. And obviously we need to consider the person's entire context because there's complete reasons as to why someone might not be eating carbs or gluten, legitimate reasons. But then also there's this feeling that we see where people are like, I really need to earn fuel. So unless I play 90 minutes, I need to earn my food. I'm not going to eat. That's a really common one that I've heard. And in the research I did, there were so many players that were like, unless I play or start, I don't get a dessert after the game. So those are some signs. And also missing social occasions, right? So like planning to I'm not going to go out with my friends tonight because it's a way to control the food that you eat. I mean, obviously some of these one-offs, they make sense maybe as for being an athlete, but over time and in combination of a lot of these, it can cause a lot of problems.
And I think that's it. Athletes tend to say that what I put in my body is going to impact on my performance. But actually, sometimes there's an element of, and I've seen that one, I'm only going to eat after I've played. So, of course, they're exhausted and they're potentially, if you're not able to put the accelerator down because you're not taking carbohydrate, it is going to impact on performance. And the issue that I have is sometimes there's a mindset of that's just a disciplined athlete. How do you get it through to those athletes that no, actually, that's a control of food behavior?
I think It's really interesting that you're talking about injury, because I think as someone that has been injured, we talked about this before, we both had quite a few ACL and knee challenges. Sorry to disclose that if you didn't want that out there.
Oh,
But we
everyone in the
are
podcast knows.
we are ACL champions here. So I think we've been in and around, and obviously your role, your job, to know that injury is a massive time when people struggle with food and weight. And I did my master's project on this, which feels ages ago, but it looked at how players experience eating during ACL injury. And loads of them found food and weight as something that they could control while they were recovering. And what was really interesting, I still need to get this paper published, but what was really interesting is that they found starving or really controlling their food as a way that they could win and feel like an athlete during a time where they couldn't achieve. And I think that was such an interesting finding. And when you put it in that context, you're like, it's not their fault. It's never their fault, right? It's the context they're in and the culture they're in. And of course, it makes sense. They've lived their whole life trying to win and trying to achieve. And now they can't. And it's, what's one area I can focus on right now? And that's food and weight. And if you take it out of the injury context, it still makes sense. It's all right, I'm playing at the highest level. I can't control what the coach is doing. I can't control if the player next to me is playing better than me and taking my spot, but I can control this final thing of food and weight. And also, I want to say, I don't think it always starts out poorly intended. I actually think it makes sense. It's, I want to get better, so I'm gonna fix this one thing that I probably didn't focus on loads growing up, because I just ate what I ate, whatever was available after the game, I ate. And now I'm older, I'm trying to get better, and this is one area I'm going to focus on. And then it spirals. And then you add the social media aspect on it. You add all these other things, like if I'm smaller, or if I look a certain way, or if I'm super lean, I'll get sponsorship opportunities. So we add all those layers together, and I think it's honestly the perfect combination for someone to struggle with disordered eating.
And it's interesting because the next kind of thing I want to go on to is sort of
Yeah.
the risk factors and pressures that you get in
Mhm.
women's football. There are certain things that increase vulnerability to disordered eating, aren't there? Social media was
Yeah.
obviously one that you mentioned there.
Yeah. So so outside of just women's football, there's age, country and culture, and genetics. So if you have a family history, there's links. I'm sure research will be disputed and challenged on this as we keep going with this. But if you have a family history of someone with an eating disorder, you're more likely to have an eating disorder. For women, gender is a huge aspect of, that's a huge risk factor for eating disorders or disordered eating. And then age, so they say younger athletes or younger women around 12 or 13 is the onset. So there's already risk factors. And then in women's football, the risk factors, I think really, I think there's loads. I think it's the high competition. I think it's the pressure. I think it's the lack of resources paired with extra pressure. So I think if we're gonna, I'm sure we'll get into this in a bit, but if you're gonna add measurements and weigh-ins and hyperfixation, we're gonna add all these measurements to their daily routine. That needs to be met with the support to help them navigate what these mean, and also how to approach it. So if a player's marking red on their testing, okay, how do they navigate it? Because simply, if I've never gone through it, I don't know how to do it. I'm just going to eat less or try to eat healthier. So that needs to be paired with nutritional support or psychological support. So we're throwing so much at players right now, I think, without the education and without the support to help them navigate.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because the minute you give players numbers, they hyperfixate on them. Not all, but some do. And body composition targets, we're going to come on to that. Weigh-ins for pre-season are probably another thing that I've seen trauma come from. I think that's fair to say. And I think the other thing, those that are exercising in a particularly hot climate are often weighed before training.
Yeah.
And if it's a double session, they're then weighed before the next. Now, that is not to check your weight. That is to check how much water you have lost between. So it is, they're trying to decrease your risk of heat exhaustion. But are these the type of things that you're finding have an impact on people with disordered eating behaviours?
Yeah, so I did interviews with 21 professional footballers for part of my PhD, and body image and eating came up as they kept being like, this is the most important topic, but it's the least supported. It's not the least discussed, but it seems to be quite, it's been out in the media, players have talked about it. It's not a silent thing per se, but it is something that's not supported in the way that they feel they need yet. And also because it's hard to support. There's so many layers to this. But what they did talk about was all these measurements and not knowing why they were doing it. So when you just mentioned weighing in for hydration, we did that when I played in the US, but we were told, okay, we're looking for this range. If you lost this much water weight by the next training session, you need to gain back this. And obviously that's very simplistic. I don't know what all went into it. That's more psychology, right? But I think for the players, it's really hard that they're given these measurements or these numbers, as you just mentioned, and they're not given much, they feel they're not given much information around it. And also, it's a little bit of an overload. It's like we talked before the podcast started about how quickly the game has grown. And I am talking more like elite women's football right now.
Yeah.
So you're giving them all these measures all the time and everything is new. And it's like, how are we weaving these in so that players can address them in a healthy manner? They have such a short career already. And then you're throwing all these measurements. All of a sudden, they didn't grow up knowing about all these different things. And now they're having to navigate it. So absolutely, the body checking and monitoring from their club is impacting.
Yeah, it does. And I think the other thing that obviously comes with that, the increased visibility, obviously social
Yeah.
media. These athletes often are having to use commercial partners in order to make some money. And of course, that puts them in the public eye a lot. How does that impact on disordered eating behavior?
Yeah, so Alex Colvin, who we both know and admire, I think a bit, but she's great doing so much good stuff. But she did a PhD on professionalization in women's football and what that looks like. And one of the main things she found is that women felt responsible, especially if we're talking England, UK, because it is a bit different, I think, in the US where it's been around longer, I guess, women's soccer. She talked about how women feel the responsibility to sell the sport and be visible and how that impacted their experiences of their body and their eating behaviors. They wanted to promote the game and look a certain way so that people would want to come and watch the game. And then it kind of changed that narrative around what women's football was and looked like in England. And they felt responsibility. Now, I, a couple of years later, did a PhD and found similar things, except the social media piece just took off in my PhD. It was about how they also needed to make more money. As we know, women footballers, until recently, they were not making very much money. I think the average salary just several years ago was £6,000, something just absolutely not good enough. And so the players were saying to me, and some of my research was, I actually don't really feel comfortable having my profile public, but I need the opportunities. So the way I get them is obviously through sponsorships. I need that extra money. And the way that I get those deals is through messaging on Instagram. And then when you add in now the social media abuse that's being part of it, is if they want to shut off those messages, they can't get those sponsorship messages anymore. So it's a catch-22 for them on how to navigate that space. And as we know, the comments are just ruthless.
Yeah, and tell me here as I kind of move into this next segment. I was obviously at a conference with you last year, and Margot Mountjoy was there, and she was talking obviously about Reds, but I remember her saying, and I know it's kind of not the same as disordered eating, but she was talking about actually sometimes when people start to control their food, they actually get a spike in performance.
Yeah.
So that reinforces that what I'm doing is good, so I'm going to do it more. But then actually comes the dip in performance and then potential stress fracture, injury, niggles, not sleeping well, potential biochemical changes, all of that sort of stuff. How does disordered eating effectively affect short-term and long-term performance on the pitch?
I guess I can talk. Yeah, I remember her saying that as well. It was really interesting because I had read it a couple times in other papers where that was what athletes were qualitatively saying, oh, it actually made me feel better. And I guess there's so many potential different reasons. Now they've focused a little bit more. They've had maybe a couple months of increased focus. Maybe they've lost a couple pounds, which has made them quicker, but then it's not been done in a healthy way. And they're getting stress fractures. And also we don't know that obviously the whole thin to win thing is not necessarily helpful for women's football at all. But yeah, there could be that spike in performance. And then as Margot was talking about, like stress fractures and all that stuff. And then from a personal experience, I think for me, when I was injured, I was like, oh, I'll have less weight on my knees and that will help me. Right. So I think there's so much working where you're like, because we're told, at least I was told several years ago, I'm getting old now, but several years ago that our quads are so big in women's football. And that's why we tear our ACL. As we know, there's so many other reasons, so many factors as to why we tear our ACL. But loads of me and my teammates were like, all right, let's just get skinnier quads then and we won't get hurt again.
Oh, God.
So and that came out in my research as well, right? So it's just, there's so much at play, but I do think there can be short-term improvements which make us feel like we're doing the right thing.
Let's have a little talk about coaches. What might they need to know if and how would they even begin to suspect that one of their players potentially has an issue with disordered eating? Because some coaches might not have healthcare
Mhm.
professionals around them. It might just be them and the players. So what are the types of things they might need to look out for?
It's quite intuitive almost because sometimes it's the players that are displaying the most care towards the sport and they're trying the hardest and they're doing everything right. That can sometimes be a warning sign. But I guess more broadly is I think coaches have so much responsibility now. They are responsible for mental health, they're responsible for everything. And I think that's where having an employed sports psychologist in the mix or a well-being person in the mix is really important. And I also think that's where education to teammates is so important because teammates are often the first people that notice what's going on. And I guess teammates are also what can impact eating behaviors either way. So there's been some research more with cross country teams, but they looked at two different teams and a team that talked positively, the captain was talking positively about food and weight. It had a positive impact on the runners versus the other team where they weren't talking so positively about food and weight. So teammates can have such a big impact on food and weight behaviors. And that came up a lot in my research is that you can get in these weird habits with your teammates where everything gets normalized. So one one player talked to me about this candy bar that they were all like, no one wanted to eat it because it was unhealthy. And then by the time we got to the end of the season, there was this candy bar. And no, and I was like, and she's now looking at that now. That's mad that we just wouldn't eat this candy bar because we were all being hyper fixed, like hyper controlling around our food and weight.
Yeah.
And she can laugh about it now, but I think at the time, if there was somebody in that mix going, hang on, guys, this isn't quite right. So I
Yeah.
think there is an education piece, especially as players are talking about this more in the media and they're much more comfortable talking about mental health. There is a space now where teammates can be educated in and around it. That doesn't mean it's going to solve it because eating disorders and disordered eating are really private and people are really protective of them.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but it could start the conversation with a teammate.
Yeah, and I think that comes down to the environment, doesn't it? Is it a supportive environment where people feel, we spoke about this before we came on to record, psychologically safe to speak out? And that isn't always the case sometimes in sport. I think people who haven't been in sporting environments don't recognize that there can sometimes be some psychological, I'm going to say control issues, and not, I don't mean about you internally as yourself, but other people looking for control of others. And
Yeah.
that can be a really difficult time, especially and if you're a younger athlete coming into that environment with older athletes and you're looking and saying, is this what I do
Mhm.
now? It's interesting how it all blends together, right?
Yeah, that's just reminded me of something one of the footballers said to me in my research was she said she was really young and she was like, I saw everyone weighing themselves all the time and I thought this is just what you do at this level. And I think we almost started getting onto this earlier, but the long-term impacts of this is that it doesn't just go away. It's like a lot of people talk about a switch flipping, or it feels like you can't get rid of it. There's something in your head. And so I think it can be really dangerous for younger players looking at those norms.
And you may or may not know this, but obviously it's not exclusive to female sport, but it's more prevalent in female sport. That's a true statement. But are there specific consequences for female athletes as opposed to what we see in male athletes?
The one thing would be that women are obviously, if we're going to look at this really broadly, they're getting paid less. So if you're hindering your career and you're shortening your contracts getting short, or you're not performing, you're not going to resign and you're not going to be left with loads of money. So there are consequences in that way.
The thing is, you obviously have bone density issues, etc. in it, but I think what I'm interested in is almost the psychological side with
Yeah.
regards to this, because I think this
Yeah.
is fair to say. Do male players, I think they've got more issues with gambling, and is
Yeah.
that fair to say?
Yeah. There's a few studies. There was one by Abbott. I think it included Scottish players, men and women, actually, but it is way more prevalent in women than men, and men do struggle more with alcoholism, substance misuse, gambling. So obviously these challenges are just manifesting differently. And I think for women that are experiencing disordered eating and food and weight stuff is it doesn't go away. And I think potentially for male footballers, I'm not going to say that it goes away for them either, but women are constantly bombarded, whether they're in sport or not, around their body. And so there's a whole other layer, a societal layer that's added that even when women stop playing football, they're still left with their body getting judged.
The one that comes up right there is Serena Williams.
Yeah.
Since she stopped doing tennis, the difference in her is incredible. And
Yeah.
this, of course, and this may not be something that you're aware of, but GLP-1, the
Yeah.
the weight loss medication, which is usually in injectable form, but I think the tablet's about to be released. I'm pretty sure that's on the way. Psychologically, have you seen anything surrounding this yet? Because I'm hearing conversations with female
Are
athletes.
you?
I'm hearing
Yeah,
conversations, yeah.
I have not heard female athletes discuss it. However,
Mhm.
I'm worried about the transition after. I think that's going to be the concerning one. But it would be really interesting to hear what you're hearing in your role around it.
Yeah, and these are not necessarily players that I'm working with, but these are practitioners who are working with
Mm.
others. And players will make jokes about they're going to get sponsored by insert brand, and and it's maybe satire, but the fact that they're already aware of GLP-1 means that I suppose practitioners especially have it on the radar, because I did a podcast a while back and we were chatting about GLP-1, and you know we'd be naive to think that players aren't going to potentially use it.
Yeah.
You'd be
Even to
very,
be
very
joking
naive.
about that, right? That's so much of this stuff is covered up with sarcasm and joking. But to be already joking about that as a female athlete
Yeah.
we don't want that. That's concerning.
Yeah, and again, and this there comes back to the culture, because when I was younger, I have seen coaches in particular make comments about what you can and cannot have with regards to food, and I'm
Yeah.
sure that you have probably more about that than I. I suppose what I want to take it forward to is, what can coaches do to positively influence the
Yeah.
situation with regards to food, fitness, body composition, etc.
Yeah, it just made me think when I did the brief eating disorder questionnaire with 115 professional women footballers in England, and 36% had experienced or met the cutoff for disordered eating. What was interesting was 35% of that 115 said they were currently trying to lose weight, or they had tried to lose weight over the last 4 weeks. So when we're talking about GLP-1 and all that, obviously they're along the same lines of wanting to lose weight and to look different. And that makes me think that there's something around language and feeling, especially during the season. They were answering this questionnaire during the season. We don't want to be trying to lose weight during the season. There's so much that can be done around language. I know people are trying to say fueling, but that can also get tricky when you're injured, is how am I supposed to fuel? But I think there's something around nourishing. And also coaches are responsible for so many things, but one thing that I don't know that they should have a foot in the door with is commenting on players' bodies. And that continues to be something that I hear a lot across all sports. This is not just women's football, but I think in women's football, it's especially toxic to me in the sense of, what are you comparing it to? Because you're comparing it to, this woman doesn't look like a male. What are you looking at? And I had
Yeah.
some players in my research say, I think they wanted me to have no hips and to look like almost a prepubescent, like to look
Yeah.
like a male, really. And it's like you're evaluating her appearance based on what is her performance suffering. So I just think and it wasn't suffering it. She said she had the best season she's ever had, but she looked fuller. She's like, that season I looked like a woman. And it's
Yeah.
like, why are we commenting?
That brings in culture and societal norms,
Yeah.
doesn't it? And that femininity that kind of
Yeah.
rears its ugly head every now and again. And I think some of the sports nutrition podcasts that I've done previously, one of the big messages that's come out of that is that please don't comment on a player's plate. There's no
Yeah.
need. If you There is a difference. If I think one of the ways I go about it, if I notice that a player's not eating a lot, that when we potentially have to go, okay, who do we speak to about this? Who's the best person to speak to and have one voice? That's probably the way that we've worked it, because many voices can muddy the water. So that's the way I kind
Uh-huh.
of think about it. Now, if somebody, however, has some kind of, oh, I've got some concerns, what would be the sort of early steps that they could take with regards to the player?
I guess it depends who's having the concerns. So if it was a psychologist, they'll have their own procedures and
Yeah.
processes and supervision in place. If it's the doctor, as will they. Someone who maybe is a physiotherapist, they might have their own processes as well, or they take it to the sports psychologist. But I think this is what's missing, actually. This question is, we're educating people all the time on mental health right now and eating. But what are the steps? What are the processes in place at your club if you do have concerns? Who do you go to? And I think that's why a lot of professional sports, are trying to bring in that one point of contact, that one well-being person that should be responsible for this. But at least helping the player then get support once they talk to them. But there does need to be one point of contact, and there does need to be a process that the staff are aware of if they're concerned about a player, because they could be wrong as well. Like
Yeah.
there are times when a player is like, hey, I'm going to really hit the ground running for the next 2 months. I want to lean out and like whatever it is, or I want to bulk up, whatever it may be. So we miss it too. You miss it either way as well. Even psychologists miss it.
Yeah.
So I guess just having those processes in place, which I feel is where what's missing right now. And it's so hard when there's staff turnover and stuff all the time in the professional game.
Yeah, and I keep coming back to this word environment, right? So, because obviously there are lots of different areas where people play football, and I've seen disordered eating and eating disorders in the NCAA with regards to college soccer. And it's quite, I'm not going to say it's common because I don't know the numbers, but they talk about in college soccer the freshman 15, right? Where you put
Yeah.
on 15 pounds when you head to college.
Yeah.
Do you know much about the research surrounding that?
I was an NCAA soccer player, so I can speak from experience a bit. Is it felt very significant in women's soccer in the US and just in NCAA sport. But I think that's also because we're about 18 years old and we're stepping into an environment where we're treated like professional athletes.
Yeah.
And we think we are a little bit as well. And which is just ridiculous when you step out of it. I'm like, oh my God. But I do think it's really also there's the context of America being quite different around food. And do we have the same? I feel different when I eat food. When I'm back in America, I'm back in Minnesota right now. The food here feels different in my body than the food in the UK when I'm back in London. So there are different challenges when you're trying to navigate food, I think, as an athlete here as well. And yeah, I remember hearing the freshman 15 as well. My dad always tells the story about how when he came home from college his freshman year, his parents opened both doors. And it's like an ongoing joke, right? That's horrible.
Oh, yeah. But and there's that joking about it again, right? And yeah, that's an interesting concept. I won't labor too much on that point for your poor dad because I know that he's in the room somewhere. So let's chat about players themselves. What is it that you want them to take away from this podcast?
I think that one thing that was really helpful for players to hear is that we may joke about it and you may hear about it stuff in the locker room, but to know that there's actually a high percentage of players that are struggling with disordered eating at some point in their career. I'm not saying their whole career, but maybe it's during injury or during a transition, whatever it may be. Players do struggle with disordered eating, and it's so much driven by the culture and the environment that they're in. And I think that takes some responsibility off of them feeling like it's like their fault, because you get a lot of people that go, why can't I just eat? It's such a simple concept. Why can't I just control this? Right. And it's like, there is no shame or guilt around something that you've not been taught to do, you've not been supported to do, and where the culture and environment around you challenges normal ways of doing.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I would say is it's not a you thing. It's something that can be supported. And it's an ongoing journey, I think, for women and men, probably women irrespective of sport already. So you're adding a whole other layer as an athlete around food and weight. And of course, you're going to have at times an odd relationship with that because it is sometimes your last resource to make that 1% improvement in your performance, or so it feels.
Yeah, and you're completely right. And I think when I go back through my own career and even just working with female athletes, I've spied it, I've picked up on it, and I suppose I do always a lot of the time come back to that environment. So what would be your top tips? What does a supportive environment look like? Now, obviously you were saying sports psychologist input would be really great, but say for example, you're at a level where, you know, that sort of amateur level, what would be the types of things that you would say, here's some of the things you might want to consider?
I think feeling, obviously, the goal would be like, can we talk about these things openly? And I think that's ambitious and lovely, but I think it's hard to do. But to feel like you can talk about some of the stuff that comes before the disordered eating or before the mental health challenges. I'm feeling really stressed and overwhelmed, or I need a break. I need a 1 day off thing happening here. I think there's a lot of things that happen before we get to people hyperfixating on their food that are missed. And those are the things that we need, that I believe should be targeted in terms of creating a psychologically safer environment. Because we were just talking with a bunch of sports psychologists at Loughborough last week. There was an event, and what we really talked about a lot was they're all just humans playing a sport as well. And I know that sounds really basic and obvious, but I think we need to be reminded that they all have everything else going on in their life as well.
Yeah.
And it's when all that stuff is shoved down and they feel they can't talk about all of it. And then you add the sport on top of it, and then maybe an injury. And then all of a sudden it is spiral.
there's so many things that, and it comes back to that human-centered sort of kind of analysis, doesn't it? And it's something that sometimes we don't have time to deal with. If you're a busy practitioner who there's only you dealing with everything, they usually don't have a lot of time. But I
Yeah.
definitely think there's an element of looking out for the person and making sure that I love the question, are you okay? Like,
Yeah.
and it is sometimes difficult to get people to open up about these things. But Carly, I know you've got a very busy day ahead of you and you've got up early to speak to me this morning. So I'm going to let you head off and deal with your day. Can't thank you enough for coming on. I've really enjoyed that chat. If you're out there and you're working with female athletes, please do follow the evidence and please give them a psychologically safe environment to talk about food. And we will see you soon.
Thank you for listening to Women's Football Hub. The information within this podcast is for informational purposes only. No material on this podcast is intended to be a substitute for medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please contact your doctor or another healthcare professional if you have any questions about anything raised in this podcast.